Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third day of AP exam review. And today we're going to be reviewing periods 5 and periods 6. We'll be going through the periods themselves, then looking at the people to know, and then looking at just a couple court cases having to do with this era that we'll actually hit on in the period review here. So periods 5 and 6, pretty big ones. We start around 1848, 1844 with these periods, and this will take us through basically the end of the 19th century and even kind of overlapping a little bit with the 20th century. You'll notice on the dates of these that oftentimes you'll see kind of varying dates. And again, it really just depends on how a teacher covers them, the crossover that you get between dates. So that's why you see like this period, sometimes it says 1848, and then other times it says 1844 as far as dates for covering that. So let's go ahead and jump on in here to period number 5. So again, that period 5, just like the period before that, is 10 to 17% of the exam. And this covers the period of 1848 to 1877. Why does it cover 1848? Well, 1848 is the end of the Mexican-American War. And you're going to see that we're going to talk a lot about during this period about manifest destiny and about the influence that is going to have upon the country. In fact, one of the biggest event of this era that we're going to talk about is the American Civil War. And you can, in many ways, kind of trace the Civil War's roots to being in manifest destiny and with the growth of the United States and some of the fighting that came as a result of that. So 1877, that is what is considered the end of Reconstruction. You have the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, the contested election of Rutherford B. Hayes for president. He gets elected, and that is seen as the end of Reconstruction because that's when the troops are going to be pulled out of the South. All right, essay topics on this. You could see a change in continuity for African Americans. Again, you will see a lot of comparing and contrasting how the lives of African Americans looked before the Civil War versus after, or they could look at it as kind of an evaluation of the Civil War and did the goals that Lincoln had at the end of the war, did those match how things ended up being for African Americans in 1877? Also, you could see the Civil War and Reconstruction as turning points in U.S. history. And again, I focus on this a lot in my class. You have turning points as far as the power of the federal government, obviously turning points in rights for African Americans as them becoming actual citizens of the United States, as well as turning points as far as the country and industrialization. You are going to see that the North is really going to build up their industrial capacity during the Civil War. And as a result of the Civil War, you're going to see really the Industrial Revolution really take off in earnest for the Northern United States. Now, this time period, again, I've already mentioned, it covers manifest destiny and the tensions resulting from manifest destiny, which are part of the issues that lead to the Civil War, and then Reconstruction ending in 1877. So, period 5, what was manifest destiny? Again, manifest destiny is that idea that the United States should exist from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that it was God-given right for the United States to expand and have all of that territory. And because it was a God-given right, nothing was really going to stand in our way as far as that goes. Oftentimes, you see this picture right here, this painting that is an angel, again, leading the people out to the Western United States. Now, there are a couple reasons for this. One is the belief in American cultural superiority. Again, the idea that the Indians should be driven off their land, again, because because the whites were culturally superior to them. Also, you had the belief in some of white racial superiority. Again, I don't think that was on a lot of people's mind as they expanded west. In practicality, most people expanded west because they wanted more land and they wanted to be able to have a farm and places for them. And again, a lot of that led to pushing not only just Native Americans off the land, but eventually Mexicans off the land as well. You were going to see in the 1844 election between Henry Clay and James K. Polk that many of the political debates during that time are going to focus on this issue of manifest destiny. And this is going to be one of those issues where most people in the country are on the side of expanding out and kind of taking the whole continent for ourselves. So that leads you to 1848, the Mexican-American War. Again, a cause of the Mexican-American War is that there were still a lot of boundary disputes between Texas and Mexico. In fact, Santa Anna believed that Texas still belonged to Mexico at this time. Texas had obviously already declared independence, and it had become a U.S. state, but really that wouldn't be truly settled until after the Mexican-American War. And then probably the bigger reason for the Mexican-American War, again, was just American desire to have more land in the West, not only have Texas, but you will see the Mexican cession as well. So U.S. would very, very easily win the Mexican-American War. They would gain the Mexican cession, again, which included Texas was already part of the U.S. at this part, so Texas was not included as part of this, but it would include New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Utah, Colorado, again, a big swath of land, California as well. All of that land would be part of the Mexican cession. Now, what is the big deal with the Mexican-American War, and how does that apply to Manifest Destiny? Well, of course, we would get this land as a result of the Mexican-American War, but then the immediate question would be, is slavery going to expand to those territories? And that would become even more of a pressing question as those areas actually got enough people to become either a state, or they were looking and organizing a territory and kind of deciding, hey, when this territory gets to statehood, how is the question of slavery going to be answered in those areas? Remember, we had the Missouri crisis that had happened in 1820. That had been resolved by the Missouri Compromise and the Missouri Compromise line. Again, that Missouri Compromise line, though, only went through the Louisiana Purchase. It did not go all the way to the ocean. Another thing you're going to see, another reason why the Mexican War is going to be so important is that's going to kind of be the training ground for a lot of troops as we get closer to the Civil War. Guys such as Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Stonewall Jackson, George McClellan, all of these guys who are going to be leading figures in the Civil War are going to get a lot of military experience during the Mexican-American War. Also, after the Mexican-American War, in response to getting the Mexican cession, you are going to have the Representative Wilmot. He's going to propose what is known as the Wilmot Proviso that promised that slavery would be banned in all land, not our land, but all land gained from the Mexican cession. Now, this never gets passed. But again, this kind of plays to a lot of Southern fears when they say, look, Northerners just want to get rid of slavery. They want to ban it completely, which scared a lot of Southerners, which again is going to kind of ratchet up the rhetoric on each side in fighting over this issue of slavery. So again, Manifest Destiny, the idea that it is our destiny to have all of the continent. Now, also during this time, you're going to have an influx of what are known as the old immigrants prior to the Civil War. That is going to lead to a nativist movement, which was anti-Catholic. Again, you're going to have a lot of these immigrants coming in that are Catholic. And in the United States, since the very beginning, since the United States is even a country, you're going to see that there is a lot of fear and distrust of Catholics. And again, a lot of that goes back to the origins of the country and the people that immigrated here from England. They hope to limit the power of immigrants through the Know Nothing Party. Again, they're asked, hey, what do you know, and or what does your party stand for? And they would say, I know nothing. And really all they were was an anti-immigrant political party. Also, you'll see them known as like the National Union Party as well. But again, more commonly known as the Know Nothing Party. Now, you're going to see also during this time that you're going to have a new legislation promoting national development. This is going to happen during and after the Civil War. Probably the most well-known of all of these is going to be the Homestead Act of 1863, which gave people 160 acres of land if they went out in the West and settled on that land for at least 5 to 7 years. So basically what it was encouraging people to do was move out west, start farms, become productive, and then if they were productive, they would get to have that land. Again, that would be a big incentive to people to move out to the Western United States and some of these new territories that we had acquired. You'd also see Morrill Land Grant, which sold land and provided money for colleges out in the West as well, again, to help promote education in those areas. Now, a big part of before the Civil War is going to be the abolitionist movement that really gets cranked up and a lot more strong during this time. We talked about with the Second Great Awakening and the role of women in that, and how with the Second Great Awakening, you're going to see the abolitionist movement grow. But again, you're going to see it grow even more during this time. Now, when we talk about this, just like when we talk about the Civil War, you got to realize that most Northerners, the vast majority of them, were not abolitionists. They did not have very strong feelings against slavery at all. Again, I would say most people were largely ambivalent to it. Some of them might have felt like that it was wrong, but they didn't really see a need to do much about it. But even though the abolitionists were small in number, they were very, very highly visible and were very, very loud with their feelings on slavery. So there would be many different arguments and ways of fighting slavery for the abolitionists. You would have fierce arguments, such as William Lloyd Garrison, who writes The Liberator, who basically he says that if you are a Christian, that you should be against slavery because slavery is against what is in God's word. So again, William Lloyd Garrison. Also, you would have people helping slaves run away through the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman and others who played a big part in doing that and helping slaves either escape to the north or even escape all the way up into Canada. And then you would have violence used in some ways. Again, probably the most well-known example of using violence to fight against slavery is going to be John Brown, who is going to use violence in 1856. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all of the fighting over Kansas becoming a state and if it was going to be slave or free, you're going to see that John Brown is one. I'm sorry about the date on that, 1854. John Brown is going to use violence out there. Then eventually he's going to come back to the east and he is going to use violence here in Virginia with a raid on Harper's Ferry, which then eventually would lead to his execution once his planned slave revolt fails. So how was slavery defended? Again, we have mentioned this before, but some saw it as a positive good. John C. Calhoun, that's what he famously called it, looked at it and said, look, this is good as a civilizing influence on African Americans. You had others, as we talked about in the early United States, such as James Madison, that called it a necessary evil. You will see, too, racist stereotyping in the country. And again, this is something that largely did not happen in the South, but actually happened in the North with the minstrel shows that happen where you would have a white performer dress up in blackface and act stereotypically like they felt like an African-American would act. Usually they would act really, really ignorant and that kind of thing. Again, that was used as a way to kind of make fun of African-Americans. Again, most of the time you did not see those shows very much in the South. They were something that was often seen in the North during this time. All right, so where were some proposals on slavery? Again, you're going to have these pre-Civil War slavery agreements, the Compromise of 1850. Again, this one gets started because California wants to enter the country as a free state. And remember, there was that big concern over the balance of power between the North and the South and having a balance of states from the North and the South or from the free and the slave states. What was the Compromise of 1850? There were 5 parts to this compromise. One, popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession, which basically meant the territories in the Mexican Cession would be able to vote whether or not that they wanted to be slave or free. With this as well, there would be a new, more strict fugitive slave law. Again, we had seen fugitive slave laws throughout history. There wasn't a lot of teeth to them a lot of times, so that's one thing that the South demanded because they were having so many slaves that were escaping and going into the North. And basically what these fugitive slave laws did was allow Southern slave trappers and that kind of thing to come into the North and find slaves and return them. Also, Northerners were supposed to return them to the South. But you'll see a lot of times abolitionists would prevent that from happening. Slave trade in Washington, D.C. was abolished. California gets entered to the Union as a free state, which tipped the balance in favor of free states. And Texas was paid money to give up claims to bordering states because you're going to see Texas with this. For a while, Texas still claimed parts of Oklahoma or what would become Oklahoma and New Mexico, and Texas gave up that. So again, what was the impact of this compromise? The largest impact of this is going to be that the North, especially abolitionists, again, most Northerners didn't really care about the Fugitive Slave Act, but it is going to be that very small, very vocal group of abolitionists that detested the Fugitive Slave Law and wanted to get rid of that, and a lot of them did not follow. So again, that's going to cause abolitionists to get even more upset. And again, even though there was this law was in place, you're going to see a lot of times in the North, in areas where abolitionists had influence, that it was not going to be actually enforced. All right. Again, more proposals to deal with the issue of slavery. Again, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You're going to have this come up. Again, really the big reason why the Kansas-Nebraska Act even happens is that you have Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois. He sought to build a railroad through the Nebraska Territory. Now, because of the laws at that time, a railroad could not go through just unsettled land. It had to be a territory with basically a process to become a state. So he proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And with that, basically what it says is that Kansas and Nebraska would be able to use popular sovereignty to determine if they wanted slavery or not. Now, Stephen Douglas introduced this, and he knew that this was going to create a firestorm when he did it. And certainly it did do that. Again, the expectation was that Kansas would probably go slave, Nebraska would not go slave. But because of the fact that they use popular sovereignty in these territories to determine that, you're going to see that, especially in Kansas, that this is going to lead to a lot of fighting. Now, within the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had set that line and said no slavery above and slavery below. It overturns the Missouri Compromise. And again, with Kansas, when it comes to time to vote, you're going to see that both pro-slavery and anti-slavery people flood into Kansas to try to affect the voting there. That is going to lead to fighting, which is why Kansas is going to get the nickname Bleeding Kansas, because of all the fighting there. And as we previously mentioned, John Brown, he would be one of the ones that would lead in some of the bloody fighting there, killing pro-slavery people in the Potawatomi massacre that would happen there in Kansas. And again, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's going to become very, very clear that the nation is going down the road to war because of the differences between the North and the South and because of slavery during this time. This will actually spill onto the floor of the Senate, where you are going to have fighting happening there between Senator Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks, when Senator Charles Sumner is caned by Preston Brooks and injured pretty badly there. So again, all of this you see 1850s is really, really, really building up to tension to the Civil War. And again, I said earlier, Kansas-Nebraska Act is 1856. So another thing that is going to lead to a lot of tension in the 1850s is going to be the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave. His owner moves into a free state, and so he felt like that he should have freedom because he lived in a free state. And really, this case advances to the Supreme Court. Abolitionists hoped that it could really settle the question of slavery in the territories. But again, in this, you're going to have a historically bad Supreme Court decision. And what the court ruled was that African Americans were not citizens and could not sue in court. Slaves were property and could not be taken without due process. And with this, basically what you are going to see is that the Supreme Court rules, as you can see there, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that Congress could not regulate slavery. Essentially, what the Dred Scott case does is legalize slavery across the entire country. Now, tell me, how do you think abolitionists are going to feel about this? They are going to be very, very angry over this Dred Scott decision made by Roger B. Taney. Again, he had been picked as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Andrew Jackson. Again, another reason why Supreme Court appointees are so important. Again, Northern abolitionists are furious, and this is another one of those things that serve to increase tensions between the North and the South. You're also going to see in the 1850s, again, a lot of presidents that aren't great presidents that don't really do anything to handle this tension. And really nobody knew what really to do about what was happening between the North and the South. So that is going to lead to the 1850s. You're going to have the birth of a new political party. Again, remember, our second party system was the Whigs and the Democrats. And during this time, you were going to have the Republican Party born. And the Republican Party, their primary platform when they get started is going to be the abolition of slavery. This starts as a sectional party in the North and the Midwest. A lot of former Whigs that felt very, very strongly about slavery would leave and go to the Republican Party. And again, That's how the Republican Party gets its start as an abolition party. Now, in the election of 1860, presidential election, you are going to see that the Republicans would actually nominate kind of a compromise candidate in Abraham Lincoln. While Abraham Lincoln, his own personal feelings might have been against getting rid of slavery all over the country, he says that he doesn't propose to get rid of slavery all across the country. He just doesn't want the expansion of slavery into Western territories. So Lincoln does run on this free soil platform, again, against the expansion of slavery. Now, within the Democratic Party, you're going to basically have the Democratic Party during this election basically destroy itself from within. Again, within the Democratic Party, you had northern factions, southern factions, and more in the between type factions. So you're going to have the Democratic Party during this election pick three candidates. Because they pick three candidates, that effectively leads to the Democrats losing the election. You can see there, their electoral college votes are going to be split between these three candidates, which allows Lincoln, again, this is the first presidential election you have in a Republican run, and Abraham Lincoln would win. Now, what would be the immediate impact of this election? You are going to see the immediate impact is Southern secession. Again, remember, Lincoln had agreed not to tamper with slavery in the South, but he did not want to see the extension of slavery. At this point, though, you're going to see there is so much distrust between the North and the South that there is no way that Southerners were going to believe Lincoln, and that is what is going to lead to Southern secession. Again, President Buchanan, he is in there after Lincoln's election, because if we remember, Lincoln isn't going to be sworn in until March of 1861, and immediately you're going to see South Carolina starts it, and then that starts a whole ripple effect of states leaving the Union. By April of 1861, you're going to have Lincoln call for troops to put down the rebellion in the South, and that is when you're going to have the upper South southern states secede, such as Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So, what are the causes of the Civil War? When we talked about this in class, I split it down into three S's. Really, mounting political tensions that had been there since the birth of the country are going to be a big part of this, as well as a failure of political will. Again, you're going to see lots and lots of compromise, but as I've told you before, it was basically putting Band-Aids on the wound, on a gushing wound, and that wound really was slavery and a lot of other things happening between the North and the South. So the first of these causes, sectionalism, again, debate over tariffs. You had the North and the South that were very, very different economically and had very, very different ways of life between the two. Because of that, in the South, tariffs were hated. In the North, the tariffs were appreciated because the North had such a strong manufacturing base, while the South did not have that, and the South was exporting most of what they were making as far as cotton went. You'd also have dividing the North and the South is defenders of slavery versus the abolitionists, and also ineffective leaders of the 1850s who should have seen, and they could have seen, or they probably did see, but really didn't know what to do about this tension that was building between the North and the South. I think the greatest example of ineffective leaders of the 1850s, again, President Buchanan, he is in there. Lincoln gets elected. Southern states immediately start seceding. And what does President Buchanan do? He doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything at all to stop the South from leaving the Union. Second, you have slavery. Again, the Dred Scott case, we've already talked about that and how that really angers abolitionists. You'd have Uncle Tom's Cabin that came out, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which was a fictional book talking about the life of a slave in the South. Many people in the North read that, and kind of people that have been on the fence about slavery read this and really, really get angry. But also it makes people in the South very angry as well, because they read this and say that's not what slavery is like in the South for every slave. Also, you have the failed slave compromises that we have mentioned before. These failed slave compromises, again, contribute a lot to the tension that you are going to see between the North and the South. Lastly, states' rights. Again, this is a question that since President John Adams had created those Alien and Sedition Acts. And in response to that, you have Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and say that a state has a right to nullify laws that they do not agree with. Again, this is a question, the nature of the Union had been one that had been going on for Basically, since the founding of the Constitution, could a state leave the Union if they wanted to? And how many rights did a state have versus the federal government? You would also have Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion in the Cotton States, as he calls it. And again, that would be the tipping points for states like Virginia, who says, look, we might not agree with secession, but we don't agree with the president calling for troops to march into the South to handle the question of secession. So the Civil War, again, you're going to see on the AP exam, they generally don't talk about specifics of war. You generally aren't going to see any questions about the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Manassas or anything like that. They generally don't ask those types of questions. Usually when they're talking about wars, they're focusing on the causes and the results of the war. So Civil War, again, Lincoln starts out the war. His stated goal is to keep the country together. After the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, you are going to see that he is going to adjust his priorities in response to that battle. And in response to that battle, he is going to make the end of slavery a priority of the war. With the Battle of Antietam, he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the areas of rebellion. Again, it did not free slaves in the entire country because Lincoln had some political concerns to keep in the back of his mind, mainly the border states, keeping them in the Union. So it only freed slaves in the areas that were still in rebellion in the South. So what is the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation? One, it changes the purpose of the war. Now the war isn't only about keeping the country together, but it is also about the elimination of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation also allows African Americans to join the military for the first true time in American history, even though you're going to see African Americans did participate in other wars. And probably the biggest thing with the Emancipation Proclamation as far as Lincoln goes is that it would help keep Europe from aiding the South. Again, Great Britain and Queen Victoria were very, very interested in putting their support and backing behind the South. And in fact, you're going to see that they're going to be the South's greatest trading partners throughout the war. But it did keep Europe from getting involved in the war because they didn't want it to make it look like they were supporting slavery, because European countries in the recent history had gotten rid of slavery. Now, you're going to see the Emancipation Proclamation. It could be compared with other documents or speeches to come out during the war, such as the Gettysburg Address, which Lincoln issues after the Battle of Gettysburg. And again, in that, he states a couple big things. One of them, again, kind of restating the goal of eliminating slavery, but also stating the goal of keeping the country together. The 13th Amendment, which is what is finally going to eliminate slavery in the United States in the Constitution. So why did the North win? One, more resources and people. And you're going to see that this is the big disadvantage that the South has in the war. South had a whole lot less population. Again, think about all the immigration that you had into the North prior to the war to work at the factories that were starting there. And again, a lot of people didn't come into the South because there just weren't jobs for people in the South. And also a lot more resources. The North had the industrial power. They had people, and again, really the big thing being the industrial power. The South didn't have that. The South kind of had two big cities, Atlanta and Richmond, that had a lot of manufacturing power, but outside of that, there was not a ton of manufacturing in the South. So that's going to be one. Secondly, military leadership. Finally, at the end of the war, the last couple of years of the war, Lincoln finally finds Ulysses S. Grant, who is a general who can be as aggressive as Lincoln wants him to be. So Lincoln wants an aggressive general. He finally finds it in Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant, even though the last 2 years of the war are going to be very, very, very hard fought, even up to the last few days of it are going to be very, very hard fought, Ulysses S. Grant is finally the general that Lincoln finds that can kind of match Robert E. Lee in ability and in aggressiveness. Effective strategies. Again, you're going to see at the beginning of the war, General Winfield Scott comes up with the Anaconda Plan, which is shown there, which was basically meant to help suffocate the South by closing down many of their ports. And that plan is actually going to be very, very effective for the war, effectively shutting off Norfolk, Charleston, New Orleans, and then finally, I think in 1865 is when Wilmington, North Carolina finally falls, which was the really became the biggest port in the South after the fall of Charleston. And then lastly, key victories. And again, probably the most key of these victories is going to be at Gettysburg, which is the turning point of the war, but also Antietam. Even though Antietam was strategically a draw, Lincoln was able to claim it as a victory to be able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So, with the Civil War, obviously, you're going to get the 13th Amendment that ends slavery. The other big part of the Civil War is going to be that roughly a week after Lee signs the surrender to Grant, Lincoln is going to be assassinated, which is going to have huge implications because Lincoln had a very specific idea had a very specific idea for what he wanted Reconstruction to look like. Now, the radical Republicans in Congress, they had a very, very different view of what they wanted Reconstruction to look like. Lincoln's goal was to not alienate the South. He wanted to reconcile the nation, but at the same time, he knew that if he did a lot to alienate the South and make them angry, that would make the whole process a lot harder. Radical Republicans basically didn't care about the South's feelings in this and had their way that they wanted to go about doing things. So, 13th Amendment ends slavery, but slavery really gets replaced with a system that in a lot of ways, or in some ways, was actually worse for African Americans and for poor whites than slavery had been, and that is the creation of the sharecropping system. Basically, these freed slave and poor whites, they would work on farms and exchange labor for using land and housing. So basically what they would do is they would get a plot of land on the farm. They could grow their own crops. But the issue with this is that half their crops were typically given to the landowner. Sharecroppers usually had to borrow a lot of money to get started from the farmer. Local stores would give them loans at very high rates. And basically what happened with the system of sharecropping is that you had freed African Americans being in perpetual debt to maybe their former slave owner, whoever the landowner was in the store. And because of this perpetual debt, they could never leave the farm. So basically what it was a different form of slavery is what sharecropping is. In fact, I usually say that I think that if Southerners had realized they could have used a system of sharecropping, they might have been a lot more likely to get rid of the system of slavery because sharecropping actually did have a lot of advantages to them versus the old system of slavery because they didn't have to really provide for and take care of the slaves anymore like they did before. So sharecropping, again, I don't think that is going to fit with the goals that Abraham Lincoln had for the after the Civil War. Now, as I already mentioned, you're going to have the radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stephen and Charles Sumner, the Sumner that we talked about in the Brooks-Sumner caning incident. They sought to increase power in the South and increase rights for African Americans. So they wanted African Americans to have more rights and to do anything that they could to help secure those rights. They also, though, wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. Now, you're going to see with the radical Republicans, if you evaluate them in the end, you're going to see that even though they are successful in getting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed, 13th ends slavery, 14th gives African Americans equal rights, and 15th give them the right to vote, you're going to see they're not successful because Reconstruction ends with the Compromise of 1877. You had the Panic of 1873, which puts the country economically in bad shape. And you're going to see that a lot of Northerners really just tire of the whole effort of trying to help out African Americans and improve their conditions. Again, once the economy goes bad, that really changes a lot of people's feelings on everything that was going on with Reconstruction. And if you think about it, by the point you get to 1877, at that point, you've had essentially Civil War and Reconstruction happening now for 15, 16, 17 years. People are just tired of it and ready to move on. So that's why you're going to see, if you kind of evaluate Reconstruction, in a lot of ways you can say that it was a failure because things, minus a return to slavery, things essentially returned to the way that they had been before the Civil War. I just mentioned the 14th and the 15th Amendment there and the importance of that. You're going to see one of the big effects of these getting passed is that it's going to lead to a split in the women's rights groups that had supported the abolition of slavery. A lot of them, though, are going to be upset that African American men would get the right to vote before women. And that is going to lead to a split, because some women are going to say, look, it's not right. We fought for the freedom of slaves. Now they have the right to vote, and we as women do not have the right to vote. So that is going to lead to a split in the women's rights groups, which really they won't come together and kind of unite again until early in the 20th century. Now, what were some other impacts of the 14th and 15th Amendment? Rights were stripped away through African Americans over time. So you would have the Jim Crow era start in the South, which led to segregation. You would have Jim Crow laws upheld by Supreme Court cases such as Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal facilities is okay. You'd also have violence. You'd have the establishment of the KKK, which starts as a wing of the Democratic Party to basically encourage whites to vote for the Democratic Party and to put fear into African Americans to prevent them from voting. You'd have the White League as well, and then lynching happening in the South. And then in order to keep African Americans from voting, poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses are all going to be tools that are put in place to ensure that African Americans could not vote, even though they had the right to do it. If you couldn't, pay this tax or read or based on your family history, you would not be able to vote. So you're going to see it's not till we get to period 8 where we'll talk about the 14th and 15th Amendment will be used to uphold civil rights and to prevent a lot of these things that would happen in the Jim Crow South. Now that brings us to period 6. Again, another 10 to 17% of the exam. Period 6, again, overlap here, 1865 to 1898. Again, 1865, you have the end of the Civil War. And really, you're going to see when this is when an economic boom will start for the North with all these factories that they had. And then 1898 is going to be the beginning of the Spanish-American War and kind of the beginning of the period of great imperialism in the United States, but not just the United States, but the rest of the world. Essay topics during this time, comparing and contrasting the goals of farmers and industrial workers. You're going to see that there's going to be a big split in those two groups in the United States during this period. Also, you will see the evaluation of Reconstruction, the successes and failures of that. So this time period, again, covers the Gilded Age, again, which is the kind of the industrial revolution of the United States as a result of the Civil War, social Darwinism, the growth of labor unions, the Populist Party, and continued U.S. expansion out west. So the Gilded Age is going to be a term that's actually coined by Mark Twain. And again, on the surface, it's going to appear everything's good. Factories are growing. Wealth in the country is growing. But you're going to see that there are a lot of problems underneath that, such as child labor, poor working conditions, inequality of wealth, where you have the rich getting a lot richer while the poor and lower classes are basically staying at the same level. Political debates during this time are going to focus on tariffs, whether or not we should have high or low tariffs. Currency, the gold versus the silver standard, which is going to be the big issue in the election of 1896. Corporate expansion, what can be done about monopolies and trust? Should the federal government step in and regulate those? Again, after the Civil War, talking about Western expansion, the U.S. government encourages westward expansion. Again, think about that old Homestead Act. They would give subsidies to railroads to get them to move out into the West as well as cheap lands. You will see, though, during this time that, at least at the beginning of the Gilded Age, that the government takes a very hands-off approach, a laissez-faire approach to the economy. Now, as Americans expanded out west, you're going to have more and more conflicts happen with the Native Americans, and treaties would be violated. Again, in the plains, you're going to have a lot of fighting with the Apaches and the Comanches and other native tribes during that time. And you're also going to see the near expansion as buffalo hides become very popular. And also people realize that as a way to control the Plains Indians who were dependent upon the buffalo, if you wipe them out, that would really take away their way of life and way of living. Now, how are relations with the Native Americans during this time? Not very good. Again, you're going to see the U.S. Use military force, most famously at Wounded Knee. Obviously, you would have a Custer's Last Stand happen during this time as well. So you're going to see a lot of warring during this time. And usually, again, because of the nature of the fight with Native Americans, you are going to see a lot of Indian massacres happen because, again, especially with the Plains Indians, you don't see the Plains Indians organizing armies and then meeting the Americans on a battlefield. They preferred to raid white man settlements. They would go in, steal lots of stuff, kill some people, and then leave. And then that is going to lead to harsh retaliation from the American army eventually. You will see that a policy of assimilation is pursued through the Dawes Act, which is known as the Dawes Severalty Act, which sought to get rid of a lot of the tribal identities. So basically what it would seek to do is take a lot of this reservation land, take and break it up into family groups, and then give the land back to the natives. So essentially it was a way to get rid of this tribal way of living and instead establish family groups who owned land and farmed on that land. Now, with the Gilded Age, you are going to see that businesses consolidate their power during this time. This is justified through the idea of social Darwinism. Again, taking Darwin's theory of evolution and applying it to society, and basically saying if people are wealthy, that means they are at the fit, and they are fitter than the rest of people. You'd also have the gospel of wealth during this time in other writings, which would encourage people to pursue wealth and the whole idea of like the self-made man. Now, you would have conflicts that would emerge during this time between businesses and conservationists over natural resources. Most famously, Teddy Roosevelt, when he becomes president in the early 20th century, he will take part in this and actually help preserve a lot of land in the West during this time. Workers, in response to the Gilded Age and how poorly things were going for workers during this time, they would organize into labor unions. You'd have the Knights of Labor, which would be the first big labor union here in the United States, which took skilled and unskilled workers. Eventually, because of labor disputes that happened in fighting, such as in Chicago and bloodshed, you're going to see the Knights of Labor actually wane in influence, and you're going to have the AFL, which is the American Federation of Laborers. They would become the prominent labor union in the country. Now, you're going to see a lot of times in these disputes that would happen, such as the Haymarket Square riot, the riot that happens at Carnegie's Steel Mill in Pittsburgh, that the government would side with business in labor disputes and try to get things going again. And a lot of times, too, because the labor unions had been directly involved in some of the violence that happened, people tended to blame the labor unions and wanted to stay away from them because of that. Now, during this time as well, you will see people wanting to have the growth of what was known as the New South. They wanted the South to industrialize, and you're going to see the South starts to do that very, very slowly. But as a result of the Civil War, you're going to see a lot of Southerners will stay in poverty until you get into the early 20th century, and that starts to improve. As a result, again, sharecropping, tenant farming would persist throughout the South. So it is going to take the South a long time to kind of recover from the Civil War and kind of, I won't say they catch up to the North, but get to the status as far as industrialization as the North. And I think that's something that's actually still even happening today. Now, as far as farmers go during this time, like we said, you're going to see a divide between farmers and those who work in the cities. And the reason for that is that a lot of things are going to go bad for farmers during this time. For one, mechanized agriculture would hurt many farmers. First of all, it's very expensive to buy these machines, but also mechanized production leads to a lot more production, which then hurts prices. Now, you're going to see that as a result of that, you're going to have the creation of these groups of farmers that will come up with organizations to try to challenge the railroads and railroad rates, as well as corporate control of the market. And probably the best example of farmers working together is going to be the creation of the Populist Party, which is also known as the People's Party. And basically what they advocate for is political reform and increased government involvement in the economy. And their Omaha platform, as we talked about when we actually went over this, you're going to see a lot of stuff from their Omaha platform will actually be taken up by the later Progressive Party. And some of these things would actually eventually come around. One, a graduated income tax, which means the tax rate gets higher the more money you make. That's something that's around today. Government control of the railroads. The government give a lot of subsidies, and you're going to see today, if you think about Amtrak, which is controlled by the U.S. government. Also, the free silver movement. Again, farmers like the idea of free silver. That caused more inflation, which would be good for farmers. And like I said, many of these populist ideas are going to be adopted by the progressive era and the progressive movement later on. Now, as far as the Populist Party goes, they are going to draw a lot of votes, but they are never going to be successful in winning a presidential election. But as you're going to see a lot of times in U.S. history, third parties, probably the biggest thing and the biggest difference that they are going to make is they are going to affect the policy positions of the two major parties. And a lot of times you'll see the major parties actually take up the positions of third parties. Now, immigration during this time, we're going to see a shift in immigration, and that you're going to have more immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe as well as Asia. And again, you see this throughout history, not just in the U.S., but all over the world, as you see an increase in immigration from other places that often is going to lead to nativism. Probably the best example of that during this time is going to be the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which severely limited the number of Asians coming into the country. Now, many Americans, again, hope to Americanize these immigrants as they were coming in. Immigrants often wanted to preserve their cultural identities, but did everything that they could to assimilate, such as learning English and doing other things to assimilate into American cultures. You will see in response to some of the issues that were happening in cities during this time, you're going to see the church's response to that would be the social gospel, where Protestant churches would sought to help end social issues in cities in a lot of different ways by helping out the poor, creating schools, and other ways to help out the poor. What was city life like for immigrants coming into this country? You're going to see that cities become very, very crowded, and conditions in the cities become very, very poor as a result of that. One of the ways that is developed to gain political control, but also to help out immigrants, is going to be political machines. Now, political machines, they helped out immigrants in a lot of ways, but again, they didn't do it out of the kindness of their heart. They expected votes in response to that. Political machines are going to control New York City and Chicago, which basically means if you hope to get elected for a position in those places, you had to go through the political machine. The best example of a political machine is going to be New York City and Boss Tweed, who ran the Tammany Hall political machine there. Now, in response to how poor conditions were in the cities, you're going to see some female reformers and others who are going to create settlement houses. Again, these were meant to help out the poor, help out immigrants, and help out women and help them adapt to American society, but also to help pull them out of poverty. Probably the best example of this is going to be Jane Addams' Hull House that she creates, again, to help out that. Also, you're going to see, as far as settlement houses, you're going to see some reform as far as mental health go, because before this, a lot of times if people were mentally ill, they were seen as crazy and just locked up, and you're going to see a movement towards treating them with a little bit more humanity than they had been treated before. Now, discrimination, violence, segregation were still very, very rampant in the country. Again, towards Catholics a lot. Again, you saw with these new immigrants coming into the country, Catholics and Orthodox Christians, a lot of people did not like them. So the American Protective Association, that's one of the things that's created to sought to keep Catholics out of office. Also, we mentioned it with the last unit, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which upheld Jim Crow laws and comes up with the idea of separate but equal. Now, you will have some prominent activists that come out and fight against how African Americans were being treated in the country. The three most famous of them is going to be Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, he advocated African Americans educating themselves, getting either a vocational education or just education in general to hopefully help pull them out of their low status in society, but also to help them gain respect from whites. You'd have W.E.B. Du Bois, who would found the NAACP. He chose to take a different approach than Booker T. Washington, and he said, look, we have to fight within the court system and do whatever we can to assure or to gain equal rights. Ida B. Wells, she would be a very, very outspoken advocate and or critic of lynching. She would write The Lynch Law in all its phases, and basically what this book did was help bring attention to how in the South and other areas of the country, lynching was used as a way to control African Americans. So, That brings us to the end of period 6 there. We're going to skip over now to people to know, and we're actually going to go through them very, very quickly. Now with the Civil War, you're going to have, or before the Civil War, John L. O'Sullivan. He's going to be the one that coins the term manifest destiny. David Wilmot, he would write that Wilmot Proviso. Again, the idea that slavery couldn't extend out into the Mexican cession territories. Again, that provision would fail, but served to cause some tensions between North and the South. Abraham Lincoln, of course, the first Republican president to be elected. Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, again, radical Republicans. And the reason we're going through these names is these are names you frequently might see, like especially in quotes on the AP exam. Jefferson Davis, he would be president of the Confederacy. Again, Jefferson Davis, who had previously served as like the Secretary of War and held other positions within the U.S. government. He was a senator as well. He would be the president of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, of course, he's like the rock star Confederate general, whereas you have Ulysses S. Grant, who will be the rock star Union general. And then Andrew Johnson, who will be the 17th president. He will actually be the first president to be impeached due to the disagreements that he had with the radical Republicans in Congress. Mark Twain, we mentioned him. He coined the term Gilded Age, talking about this new age of the growth of wealth, but also industrialization. Herbert Spencer, he's going to be a big advocate of social Darwinism within the country, which would then, of course, be used by the wealthy to justify their success. Now, some of the industrialists that you should know about, Andrew Carnegie, again, the big steel guy who writes A Gospel of Wealth, and he comes up with the idea, with the Gospel of Wealth, idea that the wealthy should use their money to help benefit society, which is why you're actually going to see Andrew Carnegie sell off his steel empire to J.P. Morgan and spend the rest of his life donating money to a lot of charitable causes around the country. John Rockefeller, again, with the oil industry, with Standard Oil, you're going to see they're the first huge oil conglomerate within the U.S. and really kind of the poster boy for monopolies within the country. And Standard Oil is really going to be the first monopoly in the country to be broken up. Cornelius Vanderbilt with railroads, again, you'll see him often vilified because he's probably the most ruthless of all of these titans of industry, as we call them. And then J.P. Morgan with finance. J.P. Morgan actually becomes so wealthy, he is able to help bail out the U.S. government when they need help in the late 19th century. Now, industrialists, they often sought to consolidate corporations to increase their wealth and power. Now, some of them didn't necessarily have cruel intentions. John Rockefeller, he felt like it was his moral imperative as a good Christian to help bring order to the oil industry, to help reduce costs, and to give better quality oil. Cornelius Vanderbilt, though, was more ruthless in just wanting to kind of consolidate power as a railroad magnate. Unions, we mentioned the Knights of Labor, the first big labor union in the country. And then you have the American Federation of Labor, founded by Samuel Gompers, which focused on skilled workers and focused on issues such as the 8-hour workday and high wages. We already mentioned urbanization and Boss Tweed. Again, look for Boss Tweed in political cartoons. They love to use him in Tammany Hall in political cartoons on the AP exam. Also, we mentioned the Hull House with Jane Addams, which she started in Chicago to help immigrants to adapt to U.S. culture, but also to help out some or others that were seen as outcasts of U.S. society. We just went through all of these key reformers here: Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And how all of them contribute, even though they had their different ways in mind, to helping fight for the rights of African Americans. Now, period 6, Helen Hunt Jackson. We have not mentioned her. She wrote A Century of Dishonor. And with that, she basically wrote that to bring attention to how poorly that Native Americans had been treated in this country. And that was what her whole goal was. Again, you're going to see it doesn't have a large scale effect, but it does bring some attention. Chief Joseph, who's going to be the leader of the Nez Perce. Again, just another one of these examples of a Native American who was pushing to try to save their culture. Now, immigrants, we mentioned immigrants, the new immigrants coming in. Again, know the difference between the new and the old immigrants. New immigrants are coming from South and Eastern Europe. They're often Orthodox Christians, some Catholics, and they usually come into northern cities to work in the factories there. On the West Coast, you would have Asian immigrants coming in as well. Now, the old immigrants usually came from northern and western Europe. These would be your English, your Germans, your French, and that kind of people coming into the country. Now, as we mentioned before, again, a lot of times immigrants would face nativism and some discrimination as they came into country, as people were very generally hostile and very suspicious of these new immigrants. We mentioned the Populist Party and the Populist Party, and then which later kind of morphs into the Progressive Party. With that Progressive Party, you're going to see the big leader of that is going to be William Jennings Bryan. He would run for president in 1896 as a populist Democrat, or Democrat, and he would give the famous Cross of Gold speech. And in that Cross of Gold speech, again, the big focus of that Cross of Gold speech was not having the gold standard, but having the silver standard. And that brings us to the end, again, of the period 6 key people that you would see. Now, the last two things we're going to cover really quickly here are 2 court cases. Again, we already mentioned the impact of the Dred Scott case, which basically stated that African Americans had no rights here. And again, this serves as a big thing to cause tension between the North and South prior to the Civil War. Also, in 1883, you would have civil rights cases that would happen, which said that Congress could not outlaw racial discrimination by private individuals and or groups. And these kind of serve as the precursor to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which was the Supreme Court case that came up with the idea of separate but equal, that you could separate whites and blacks as long as the facilities were equal. We know, obviously, that the facilities were not actually equal. Again, I encourage you with this. I know that this was a ton of information to have to go through. Slow it down, kind of take notes as you go along. And again, go back and hit those areas that you really, really need help. And again, this is meant to be just one of many tools. Hopefully, maybe something that I've said, if you get a short answer question or something, you need to know something specific, this will help you in doing that. So good luck in your studying of periods of 5 and 6. The next period we'll cover, the next video is going to be devoted just to period 7 because period 7 covers a lot of information. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this and have a great day.